homicide, the woman accused of the worst crime in Pickens County history.
She staged the crime scene to look like a murder-suicide.
She walked into the courtroom with a smile on her face.
And what the authorities saw left them in utter disbelief. There is no love quite like a mother's, right? Nurturing, loving, and selfless, mothers are powerful creatures. But the responsibility of it all isn't for everyone to handle, and sometimes the switch just goes off. Today we're exploring the world of mommy murderers and seeing just how a woman who brings children into this world can just as easily take them out. Andrea Labbe was a loving mother of two. From the outside, her life was picture perfect with a beautiful family. It all went wrong one evening when she stabbed her 3-year-old daughter and her husband to death, before ending her own life. But wait till you find out how her 7-year-old lived to tell the tale. Then we have a mom who turned into a killer just so she could get her hands on some money. Susan Hendricks admitted to shooting down her whole family to collect over $700,000 in life insurance policies. But how did it all go down? Lastly, we have Isabel Martinez, who sacrificed her children to what she calls an evil force in one of the most brutal murder stories in history, sparing just one of her 5 kids. How was she caught and punished for her crimes? Let's dive into the moms who flipped and killed their entire families. The Labbe family consisted of Andrea, her husband, and their 2 beautiful daughters, 6-year-old Zoe, Bridget, who is nearly 2, and Margot, who is just 7 months old. Their day started like any other. The 2 girls woke up expecting their mom to give them breakfast like she did every other day. However, Andrea had something else planned for that day. One morning in December 2004, police were called over to the Labbe house, only to find it mysteriously quiet. The police knocked on the door, and when no one answered for a couple of minutes, the door was then broken down, and what the authorities saw left them in utter disbelief. Right as they entered the house, the police found a man brutally jabbed in his stomach with a kitchen knife, alive but barely breathing. On a closer inspection, they also found the killer mom had shown no mercy to her 23-month-old. She had a deep wound on her neck that had gone far enough to damage her tendons. Zoe was also writhing in pain from multiple wounds, and somehow, Margot was the only one who was left unharmed. By the time the paramedics could come, Zoe did not have any vital signs, and Greg had also given in to his injuries. Bridget and Margot were the only people in the house alive at this point. As far as Andrea herself goes, she had also stabbed herself with the same knife that she had attacked her family with, and was now lying unconscious in the master bedroom of the couple's 2-story house. The entire family was rushed to the hospital, where only Bridget regained consciousness. The poor girl, along with her younger sister, had nowhere to go, so they were taken in by their Uncle Greg. As a result of her injuries, Bridget was left with the left side of her body almost paralyzed and had required intense physiotherapy to be able to move normally again. At the same time, she had to go through several therapy sessions to be able to get over the trauma of what she had experienced, as her mom went ballistic and murdered half her family in front of her. And while Bridget doesn't remember everything that went down that day, it's pretty evident that she still suffers from a lot of PTSD. As far as Andrea's brother goes, he continues to remain shocked at how his sister could have committed such a crime. Along with his wife Susan, Greg has tried to think of a moment when Andrea seemed like she was suffering mentally. According to Greg and Susan, Andrea liked to keep things in. However, Greg and Susan still recall Andrea appearing way more exhausted than usual a few weeks before her death. They remember her mentioning how she never had any time for herself. However, she always went back to caring for the kids, like the responsible mother she was. What's more surprising is that a week before her strange death, Andrea had hired a nanny to take care of her children for a few hours every week so she could spend some time on her own. But for a switch to flip inside her like this, it was something that no one could have seen coming. According to psychologists, Andrea suffered from extreme postpartum depression after the birth of Margot, and one day she just couldn't take it anymore and ended up going on a murder spree. The truth is that most people really don't know what postpartum depression can do to your brain. So, while Andrea's family and friends believed that she was just stressed out or tired, the reality is that she was experiencing extreme bouts of emotional highs and lows, fatigue, anxiety, and even a feeling of hatred toward her newborn child. Around 15% of new mothers deal with the condition and have trouble taking care of their babies. But it's such a taboo and not discussed due to the feelings of shame. And because Andrea had experienced postpartum depression with all of her kids, every pregnancy intensified her condition. Her symptoms lasted several months, leaving her unstable to perform everyday tasks. Andrea would often be found crying, and because the people around her didn't notice the signs, they chalked it all off to a couple of bad days, hoping that eventually everything would be okay. Because her condition was left untreated, Andrea developed what doctors call postpartum psychosis, a condition that only affects 1 in 1,000 people. This is when her regular symptoms started to escalate, and she started feeling hopeless and paranoid, and went into a state of mania, which is when she attacked her family as brutally as she did. Even though it's been almost 2 decades since this unfortunate family massacre, it still manages to shake up just about anyone to this day.
Ms. Hendricks has a long-standing mental disorder. She's had psychiatric admissions since the late 80s. The week before this crime occurred, she was diagnosed in Dr. Schiavone's office as having a bipolar disorder, an obsessive compulsive disorder, a post-traumatic stress disorder, a generalized anxiety disorder, and a borderline personality disorder.
Money makes you do crazy things, but this mom took her love for money to a whole new level when she decided to sacrifice her entire family for it. Susan Hendricks lived in South Carolina and was 48 years old when she was charged with the murder of 4 members of her family, living in different houses. It all started on October 4th, 2011, when the police received a call from a woman named Evelyn Burns, who was Susan's sister. While Burns didn't really know what was going on inside the Hendricks household, all she told the police was that she was worried about her family and her sister. When the police made their way to Susan's house, they saw a horrific trail of blood as soon as they entered the house. The trail led to the bodies of Matthew Hendricks and Linda Burns, Susan's son, and her stepmother, who was in her mid-60s. The police then made their way to the house next door, where they found Susan's ex-husband Mark and her second son in an even worse condition. Marshall, Susan's second son, had also been shot multiple times along with her husband, and both the men were found dead, propped up on one of the couches in their home. According to Susan herself, she only had to shoot at her elder son Matthew once. But as Marshall tried to run away and push past her, she shot him 4 times, killing him on the front porch and then dragging his body inside. But what turned her into this monster?
Ms. Hendricks, as a child, had very severe sexual abuse and physical abuse. Post-traumatic stress disorders are all secondary to that abuse that she experienced. Your Honor, I won't go into specifics, but I know from your time in the solicitor's office and as a judge, you've seen some very bad cases of sexual abuse. This is the worst I've seen. She has what we call a dissociative identity disorder. You might know it as a multiple personality disorder.
But this spree was not a bout of psychosis. It was premeditated. Before she murdered her family, Susan came prepared with a fake side note from her son, Matthew. Once Susan was done with the killings, she called her sister and tried to make her believe that Matthew had ended himself and the others, pinning the whole thing on her dead son. When the authorities showed up, Susan went up to them sobbing as she showed them her son's fake side note where he was confessing to his crimes. And she would have gotten away with it too, if it wasn't for forensics that caught her in her lie. Experts found out that the note's handwriting wasn't a match for Matthew's. While Susan tried really hard to keep up the lie, there was no saving her at this point. Later on, a group of psychiatrists found that Susan's mental state was in absolute shambles because all of the abuse that she had gone through during her childhood. As a result, she grew increasingly violent, and all of it came to a bubbling point when she fell into a financial crisis. The instability stemmed from her abusive childhood and had followed her all the way to motherhood, after she realized that she had a hard time forming meaningful bonds with her loved ones. And while Susan tried to claim she was suffering from a dissociative personality disorder when she carried out the shooting, the doctors still found her sane enough to label her a criminal. rather than a mental patient.
This was all done to avoid a trial. Hendricks pleaded guilty but mentally ill to 4 counts of murder. That means she will get treatment for the rest of her life in prison, but she is not eligible for parole.
To plead guilty for 4 charges of murder.
With her voice cracking at times, Susan Hendricks admitted her guilt.
This ended the Hendricks family name for us. They were the last males to carry on that name, but they'll live on through us.
Ultimately, ended up confessing that she killed her family members because she wanted to collect their life insurance policies worth $700,000. In one of her statements, Susan said that her family used to pray together all the time. And even on the fateful day of their murders, she waited before all of them had prayed together for the last time before opening fire. And if that wasn't scary enough, this wasn't the first time Susan had been involved in a mass crime like this. In fact, in April 2006, the woman shot and killed 39-year-old Doyle O'Brien Teague after he allegedly entered her trailer without permission. The reason why she got away with shooting back then was that she claimed self-defense. But considering the ease with which she wiped out her whole family, I'm not too sure about her version of the story being all that accurate. After pleading guilty for her crimes, Susan used her apparent dissociative personality disorder to earn herself a plea deal where she gets to spend the rest of her life in prison without the possibility of parole, instead of being given the death sentence, which might just be what she deserves if we're being honest here.
Isabel Martinez pleaded not guilty to all of the charges. She walked into the courtroom with a smile on her face, just as she did during her first court appearance last year.
Isabel Martinez was a mom who would do anything to protect her tribe. But in her paranoia, she took things a bit too far when she started believing that some kind of evil forces were after her family. Living in Gwinnett County, Georgia, Isabel Martinez led a pretty normal life until the death of her father. Then, sudden demise left her shocked, and her mental state was pretty unstable for a while. This led to a downward spiral, and she started getting involved in extremely shady habits to try and contact her father's spirit. This is how she ended up believing that the only way to bring her father back was to sacrifice the rest of her family members, including her husband and 5 children. So while the mother pretended like everything was fine, she was secretly plotting her murder scheme. According to investigations, Isabel believed that she had to put everyone in her house to sleep because that was when her father would be able to return back to her. She had grown extremely delusional and was clearly not in the right frame of mind to be able to think logically. So in April 2017, Isabel woke up in the middle of the night, and that's when she decided to execute her plan. As her family slept, Isabel grabbed a knife, and first she attacked her husband, Martin Romero, aged 33. According to her statement, Martin woke up as she was murdering him and pleaded with her not to do what she was doing. However, Isabel didn't listen to a word that he said and continued to stab him repeatedly until he passed away then and there. She then moved on to murder her children, including 10-year-old Isabella, 7-year-old Dakota, 4-year-old Dylan, and 2-year-old Axel, while her elder daughter Diana was only injured and not killed during the process. Diana, who was 9 years old at the time of the murders, claims that before Isabel injured her with the knife, she asked her daughter for forgiveness and told her that she was going to the sky to see Jesus. According to Martin's sister, Salazar, Martin was a family man who loved his children and was always finding excuses to get the whole family together. Isabel was just like him, a doting mother and a great host to everyone. The family lived in Chicago and had recently moved to Gwinnett County, and they all seemed pretty happy from what others remember of them. But clearly, greater and many sinister things were at play here. When the woman was presenting in front of the jury, her behavior was enough to scare anyone off. It was almost as if she had been possessed. When asked to make a statement, she started smiling the creepiest smile, gave the jury a thumbs up, and started moving as if she was praying. The woman also went on to say that she had felt a devil-like spirit take over her when she was on vacation in Savannah with the rest of her family, a few days before the attack. That is where she decided that she would put them all to sleep and reunite with her deceased father. Isabel's friends claimed that she was the perfect mother and wife before her father passed away. But after his death, there had been a sudden shift in her state of mind, where she started talking about doing anything it took to bring him back. And that's where it all went wrong. Another one of Martin's cousins, Griselda, told investigators that she overheard Martinez saying that she was just waiting for a signal to act upon the devil's wishes and that she had already promised her children to an evil force in return for her father. Reports say that Martin had also taken his wife to a doctor who had prescribed her antidepressants to cope with her struggle. Martin then took on the responsibility of administering the medication to his wife, scared that she would attempt to overdose if he had handed them over to her. To help her own self, Isabel had gone to a priest 14 days before her murder spree and told him that bad people were chasing her. The priest reassured her that this was all in her head, but of course he failed to get through. And while Isabel previously had no history of violence, the reason why she went down this route was because of how the grief of her father's passing had altered her brain. The trauma had left her unable to process her emotions, and so she let them out in the most unhealthy way possible. Isabel's grief made her hold on to delusional hopes, and because that was her coping mechanism, she just couldn't distinguish the lines between reality and imaginary. As far as the crime scene itself goes, Isabel had placed Bibles on top of her dead husband and children, dragging them onto the same bed. In 9-year-old Diana's own words, she had seen her mother stabbing her siblings and telling them that they were going to the religious clouds. Diana also revealed how her mother suffocated her siblings before stabbing them so they wouldn't be able to fight back or run. And the only reason Diana made it out alive was that Isabel somehow forgot to do the same to her.
Newly released investigative reports show when Isabel Martinez first walked into a courtroom, one day after being arrested, she had already admitted to murdering 4 of her children and her husband. During her first court appearance, and despite a judge's advice,
"Ma'am, I'm going to caution you to cut out the display for the cameras."
Martinez smiled often and showed strange behavior.
She herself admitted to all her crimes, but she claimed that she did what she did so that her family could achieve ultimate salvation. Isabel claimed that she sent her family to heaven because she loved them with all of her heart, and all she wanted was for all of them to go to the heavens. All of these stories show just how intense motherhood can be, and how one step in the wrong direction can turn you from a nurturer to a brutal murderer.